Hi everybody and welcome to our Apprenticeship Service webinar today. We're going to be looking at giving you an update with some information about the Growth and Skills Levy and some of the related Apprenticeship Service developments. And this session is for both employers and for training providers. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team, and I'll be doing the hosting for today's session. This webinar was due to be delivered a week or so ago, but as you know, unfortunately, we had to postpone it at the last minute. I'm really sorry that we had to take that decision last week, and I hope it didn't inconvenience you all too much. But I'm really pleased that so many of you have been able to join us today for this rescheduled session. Can I do my usual reminder at the beginning of webinars and just advise you that the webinar is being recorded? And can I remind you that by registering and attending today, you've given your consent and you're agreeing for the webinar to be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. But if you feel that you've changed your mind regarding that consent, can I ask that you please dial off? As for the recordings for the session, I'll tell you how you can access these a little bit later on. So hopefully you'll all notice that you've all automatically been placed on mute and you'll stay on mute throughout the webinar. And then one last point on the domestics. Our usual practice is for these webinars to be not on camera whilst we're talking. This is because of the large volume of people that join our sessions and potential worries about possible bandwidth issues. And this is especially relevant today as we're expecting probably the largest number of attendees that we've ever accommodated on a webinar. So sorry that you won't get to see our lovely presenters today. So the plan is that we're going to run through a recap of the Growth and Skills Levy and some of the key changes that have been just announced. And we'll give you an update about the Apprenticeship Service and some of the upcoming developments in there. Then after we've covered that, we'll go into our first Q&A session. And once we're done with the Q&A session, we'll take a look at how the Apprenticeship Service is developing to accommodate the launch of apprenticeship units, and we'll give you a live demo of that. And then we'll move into a second Q&A session related to the Apprenticeship Service apprenticeship units input. And then once all that's done, I'll let you know how you can access a handout for today's session, which has all of the key links that we'll be referring to during today's session. If you've got questions for any of the presenters today, you can pop them into the questions tab on your control panel. So you should see this on the right hand side of your screen. If you look for the heading called questions, click on that and type them in there. We'll try and cover as many of them as we can during the session, and we'll certainly try and cover the main points that you raise in the Q&A session, even if we don't get around to answering each individual question. And if there are any unanswered questions, what we'll do is we'll take those away and we'll get some clarification points by theme, and we'll send them out to you all by email in a couple of weeks' time. Please, if you can, only ask questions that relate to directly to today's session. We won't cover questions that don't relate to our topic today. I know that the draft funding rules for apprenticeship units was published a couple of days ago, so for example, if you've got questions about that, I'd rather you put those through the consultation process or speak to the help desk, but we won't be looking at those sort of questions today. In terms of timings, we're expecting that we'll run for about 90 minutes, but we may need just to nibble a couple of extra minutes at the end, depending on how the questions and answers go. And can I remind you all that at the end of the session, as you leave our webinar, you get directed to a short survey. We'd love to know what you thought about today's webinar. So please do take a moment to answer a couple of quick questions and give us your feedback. Today I'm joined by probably the largest panel of contributors I think we've ever had. We've got Kate Ridley-Pepper, who's the director of our Work-Based Skills Directorate, and I've got Gary Tucker, who's the Deputy Director of the Apprenticeship Service. And we also have Perdip Nahal, Amika Shah and Sam Miller from our dev teams, and they're the ones dealing with the work relating to apprenticeship units, amongst other things. And then joining us for the Q&A panel, we've got Chris Bradley, Sarah Tulk, Tom Errington, Shona Hutton, Mary Evans and Jason Paul. So we've got a cast of thousands. So a big welcome to all of you. Okay, that's probably about enough of me. So I think we're ready to start. I would like to hand over to Kate Ridley-Pepper, who will be taking us through the first part of the webinar and talking you through all things Growth and Skills Levy related. So Kate, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. I'm Kate Ridley-Pepper. I'm the Director of Work-Based Skills in the Department for Work and Pensions. So that covers apprenticeships, the Growth and Skills Levy and skills boot camps. And what I'm going to do to sort of kick off the session is do a bit of a presentation about where we are and the announcements that have recently been made and why they've been made. And what I'll then do is run through in a bit more detail the elements of those announcements to give you a bit more information about each of those. But then, as we've heard, there will be an opportunity at the end to also have some questions and answers if that hasn't covered everything. So just to kind of kick us off, I'll do a bit of a recap. So we made various announcements back in November and December, which included a extension of our fully funding apprenticeships in SMEs for 16 to 24-year-olds. So that was an increase in the age range of people who were eligible for that. We also announced quite a few system changes aimed at simplifying the system. So we've removed the 10% levy top-up. We've shortened the amount of time that funds are in accounts before they expire. And we've also reduced the government co-investment from 95% to 75% when levy payers overspend. And I'll come on in a second to talk about some of the rationale behind those changes and why it is that we've made those. We also announced that we were introducing an MSA brokerage pilot, so that will be launching soon, working with local mayors to help them connect young people in their areas with SMEs. So those were things that happened before Christmas. And then earlier on this week, the Secretary of State, as part of much bigger reforms around the Youth Guarantee, announced some additional changes to apprenticeships. So that included a new incentive of £2,000 for non-levy paying employers who take on a new 16 to 24-year-old employee as an apprentice. That will be coming in for apprenticeship starts from October. We also announced the expansion of foundation apprenticeships into retail and hospitality, and those will include the £2,000 incentive, and that will be from April. And we're really pleased that we're launching a new level 2 admin assistant apprenticeship, which will be funded for 16 to 24-year-olds. We've also announced the first apprenticeship units, which are going to be focused on priority sectors in the industrial strategy, which include AI, digital, construction and engineering. Those will also be available from April. And then from September, we're going to withdraw funding from 16 apprenticeship standards, which ministers have decided don't align with our priority pathways or workforce needs, and that will enable them to focus more investment on young people and on critical skills gaps for the economy. And then, as I say, that was part of a much wider announcement around the Youth Guarantee. So in total, that announced £1 billion worth of investment over the next 3 years. That includes an employer hiring incentive worth £3,000 for young people who've been on universal credit and looking for work for 6 months. And they've also extended and expanded the jobs guarantee scheme. So that has gone from being for up to 21 to being to up to 24. So that's the sort of context of the announcements. I'll just move on to the rationale for change. So if you've listened to the Secretary of State's speech, he will have covered this in quite a lot of detail, but ministers feel really strongly that over the last decade, apprenticeship starts amongst 16 to 24-year-olds have fallen by 40%. At the same time, over half of apprenticeship starts are now people aged 25 and over. And we're seeing 1 million young people who are currently not in education, employment and training, so people who are NEET. And ministers are really concerned that that trend shows that our current system hasn't delivered the opportunities for young people, and so further action needs to be taken to tilt and to pivot the apprenticeship programme, along with a huge range of other levers across government, to focus much more intensively on young people. So we know that apprenticeships deliver huge value for the economy, they're great for employers, they're great for learners, but they're not the only way to meet future skills needs. And we know that businesses have called for greater flexibility. The government committed in its manifesto to delivering that through the Growth and Skills Levy, which included the introduction of short courses or apprenticeship units. But part of the challenge is that in delivering that focus on young people and delivering on the call for greater flexibility, we have a finite budget. Over the last 4 financial years, the government spent around 98% of its multi-billion pound apprenticeship budget. Last year, we spent all of the apprenticeship budget. And so in order to live within that budget, deliver on those national priorities, deliver on those short courses and the call for greater flexibility, it is essential that we reform the apprenticeship programme so that it's more sustainable in the future. We know that there's a big misconception that there are large sums of unspent funds, and as I say, we're making some changes to how the levy system works to try and address that by removing the 10% top up, which doesn't accurately reflect the funds in our budget. And taken together, those measures announced in the package will support that pivot to young people and make sure that the funding is directed towards those priorities that ministers have set, so that going forward we do deliver on that flexibility for business and that focus on young people. So I'll move on now to the individual elements of that offer. So starting with the SME incentive. So from October of this year, there's going to be an incentive of up to £2,000. That's going to be for non-levy paying employers, and that's going to apply to new members of staff who are between the ages of 16 and 24, who are brought in as apprentices. That's part of these wider reforms as part of the Youth Guarantee, aimed at creating more apprenticeship opportunities for young people. It will apply to apprenticeship starts from October, as long as they've joined their employer within the last 3 months, so any time from the 1st of July onwards. And that's in recognition that often an individual will join an employer, but it might take a few weeks or a couple of months before actually they're enrolled on their apprenticeship. So we wanted to make sure that those people remain eligible. The first payment will be made once the learners completed their first 90 days in the apprenticeship. And we will do a cross-check with HMRC data just to make sure that that is a new employee. Because the first payment will be made after 90 days, that means that the earliest payments will start from the 1st of January 2027. And it's worth noting that that payment is in addition to our existing foundation apprenticeship incentives and any other incentives. So if you are also doing a foundation apprenticeship, you would also receive the £2,000 for that as well. So I'm going to move on now to foundation apprenticeships. So we introduced foundation apprenticeships last year. These are intended to support young people at the start of their career who need a broad range of occupational experience and employability skills. And we recognise that often when young people start an apprenticeship, they don't necessarily know a huge amount about the occupation. It can be quite daunting to try and specialise into a particular apprenticeship. And so this responds to calls from employers and from young people for a product that offered that wider range, that allows them to try a couple of different occupations before going on to specialise. And what that should hopefully do is allow young people to make a much more informed choice, but also reduce the number of young people who are dropping out of apprenticeships. So we know that a lot of young people who drop out in the first 3 months do so because they realise this isn't quite the occupation for them. So by offering this breadth, that will give them that practical experience, allow them to gain those employability skills, and then be in a better position to know where to go next in their career. Those initial occupational standards were made available from August, and those first ones were aligned with the industrial strategy occupations. As I say, that includes a £2,000 employer funding incentive in recognition of the additional costs of recruiting and supporting young people. Providers have been rolling that out in the months since then, and we're increasingly seeing young people being recruited into cohorts. As a next step, we are now expanding that offer out beyond the industrial strategy, and the first 2 areas beyond the industrial strategy that we'll be expanding that to are retail and hospitality. And that's in recognition of a huge number of jobs are available to young people, taken by young people in retail and hospitality, and those are fantastic sectors to act as a springboard and a starting point for someone's career. Very pleased that those will also include the £2,000 employer payments for those learners as well, and that delivery will be available from April of this year. Going to move on now to apprenticeship units. So as I mentioned at the beginning, employers have often called for shorter, more flexible training in order, in particular, to deliver upskilling or particular skills gaps where technology might have moved on or things might have evolved and someone doesn't have a very specific skill available to them. We'd heard from employers that sometimes they were having to enrol members of staff on a full apprenticeship when actually what they wanted was just to access particular elements of it. And that's not a great use of employers' time or employees' time. And obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, that puts challenges on our budget. So apprenticeship units are designed to be short, flexible training programs. They are very much focused on specific critical skills gaps. We've called them apprenticeship units because they draw on those existing apprenticeship standards, which we know provide a high quality employer designed content. So we've got that rigor, we've got that confidence in the content. These first ones are aimed at upskilling adults. They're available to people who are 19 and over, who are already in work. So these initial ones are not about preparing people for a new occupation. They are about addressing skills gaps, drawing on content from existing apprenticeships. And as I say, that should provide a sort of fast, more agile alternative to that full apprenticeship. And we will expect those to last between about 1 and 16 weeks. We've announced the first 7 of those, and the column on the right-hand side shows what those are. So as you will see, these are typically in areas where someone might be working in a sector, but they don't necessarily have that skill. Maybe the technology has moved on. So we've got the AI leadership, we've got electric vehicle charging point, solar panel installation and maintenance. So they're the kind of things that an existing member of staff would benefit from gaining those additional skills. As I say, they'll be built from the knowledge and skills within those existing apprenticeship standards and designed to meet those critical skills gaps. They'll range between 30 and 140 hours in length, and hopefully they will provide those employers with that more flexible option. Going forward, we're really keen to work with Skills England, employers, providers, other critical stakeholders to understand what other apprenticeship units or short courses might be valuable, how we might develop a wider range. So these 7 are the very first ones, but we'll be continuing to work with the sector and identify where else we might benefit from these courses in the future. In terms of the key dates, the funding rules, the draft apprenticeship unit funding rules were published on the 17th of March. We've asked for feedback on those by the 31st of March. In terms of the provider eligibility, we will be contacting providers on the 30th of March to let them know whether they'll be eligible to deliver one of those first 7. And if you haven't been contacted but think you should have been, then do reach out to the support team. And we'll be publishing more details of the delivery hours and the funding rates and the detail underneath each of those courses during April. In terms of the delivery dates, training providers can begin to deliver those as soon as their organisation has been approved. So we're hopeful that that will start to happen during April. So that's apprenticeship units. I'll move us on now to streamlining. So as I said at the beginning, streamlining that suite of apprenticeships has been a really important part of reprioritising how we use our funding. As you'll know, we now have over 700 standards which have developed over time. And it's right that ministers have taken this opportunity to look at that suite and to make choices now that we've reached a point in the programme where starts and costs are as they are. Ministers have looked across that suite to take decisions about where to reprioritise funding. It's really important that that creates the headroom for these reforms. So taken as a whole, this is quite a significant part of our budget that has gone into funding the standards that are being streamlined, and that's now going to free up additional funding to support some of those new standards that we're introducing and to support young people and those short courses. So that should realign that core apprenticeship offer against the government's priorities. So that is particularly young people and the industrial strategy. As part of that focus on young people, that will help us to deliver the 50,000 apprenticeship ambition for young people, including through the additional foundation apprenticeships that I've spoken about, and also allow us to fund those short courses that employers have been asking for. Moving on, there's a list here of the standards that are being defunded. This is available more widely as well, but you'll see there that there are 3 leadership and management courses: Chartered Manager, Operations Manager and Team Leader. And then there are additional 13 other standards that we're also defunding. That will take effect from September. There are some conversations with some employers, with some providers who deliver significant volumes of these, to have a slightly extended delivery period, but it will start to happen from September this year. I'm going to pause there and hand back to Nick.
Thanks very much, Kate, for taking us through those slides in so much detail. That was really good, and you sparked quite a few questions coming in, which we'll get to in the Q&A session in a little while after we've heard from Gary. So up next we have Gary Tucker. He will be talking us through he will talk to us about the Apprenticeship Service and how it's being developed to accommodate all of the things that Kate has pretty much just mentioned. Okay, Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Kate. So there's lots of activity at the moment on the Apprenticeship Service to accommodate these new products that Kate's just gone through. It's a very busy service. We've been well established now for nearly 10 years, and we first started, probably a defining moment was back in 2017. With the delivery of the Apprenticeship Levy. Since then, we've got the 20,000 levy paying employers, we've got SMEs on the service, and we've got about 300,000 employer accounts with well-established links into HMRC for all of the working out the levy to pay for apprenticeship training. And obviously, we've got the provider, the APAR, the provider register, where providers join to get their funding, and that's where we make all the payments from the Apprenticeship Service. We are a busy service. We have a number of delivery teams who are working very hard to make sure all of the products that Kate was talking about then are available for employers and providers. And it will start from the 1st of April, although foundation is still there, but there'll be a couple more introduced soon. So really the service is apprenticeship.gov, which you can go in, and I would urge any employers who haven't already created an account, go in, create an account, as that's where you can start to look and find apprenticeship training for your standards, and pick a provider. If you're a provider, you can join the register. And we have a new addition. Last year we had the Apprentice app, which is for apprentices to manage their knowledge, skills and behaviours, and it really enables them to manage their apprenticeship as they go through. The other big transactions obviously is find an apprenticeship, and from the 300,000 employer accounts, the employers can advertise vacancies. So it's all supported by a well-established support model. So if you do have any problems, do call us, and we can talk you through that. But as you'll see in the slides that I'm going to get to, we're going to introduce new functionality over the coming months. So if we go on to the next slide, there's some journeys there. So for the apprentice, there's lots of informed content up front, and we will be making some changes to apprenticeship.gov to give more advice and guidance to young people. Employers also, there's lots of information on how to engage in the apprenticeship program, and there'll be more coming on stream in apprenticeship.gov on the new products, and for providers how to join the register. And obviously also we have a service for endpoint assessment organizations as well. This slide, the journeys we have updated, so we will have an updated version of this out in the public domain quite soon. If we go on to the last slide, I'll talk about the individual bits of functionality that we're working on, and it's broken down into we've obviously got October to December. We've already made quite a lot of changes to the service, so the green ticks means that it's actually live and we've finished it. You've got a green tick which is a bit more transparent, which means we're still working on that functionality, but it'll be available soon. And then there's obviously some stuff in progress that we're working on. So levy transfers, we have made some changes to the finance pages. So really this is in response to employers who wanted detailed breakdown on their transactions, but also giving employers visibility of the levy that's available to them. We've made changes in the service to respond to policy around level 7. So you can still do a level 7 if you're 16 to 21. But we have made changes in the service to respond to that policy, and there's lots of notifications in the service. We have Gov Notify, which allows employers to provide feedback on providers, and then that's actually then given a star rating in the service, which really gives employers an idea of how the provider is operating. So that's updated in the service. So that's at the point where an employer is picking a provider, but it does mean that the update and that feedback quite regularly gives employers a really good feel of the provider that they're going to be working with. And then things like eShot allows us to keep employers and providers updated on via email and other mechanisms on changes in the service. What I should say though is, as we put more of these products on the service, we'll be running more of these webinars to go into detail. Between January and March, so up to around now, HMRC employment checks, we're working on those, and this is really compliance checks, and we need to, as Kate mentioned, when we look at things like incentives, we have to use HMRC employment checks to check that an employee is a new employee. So we'll be using that functionality when it comes to delivering incentives. We're responding to changes in the assessor and reforms. So there's bits of functionality in there, and a big piece for us at the moment is simplifying payments. So there's been lots of engagement with providers on this around we call it earn and pay. So this is how we're going to be paying in the future, but really trying to simplify the service for employers and providers so that providers only have to key in data once, but also we're trying to eliminate as much as possible the data locks so that providers get paid for all of the learning that happens. And at the moment, obviously, we are very busy on looking at all of the functionality around apprenticeship units. So there's lots of functionality that we're working on around payments and how we facilitate that. So there's more than just getting the apprenticeship units into the service to be able to pick. We have to pay for those as well, which is quite a complex piece. From April, we're looking at things like there's other things around certification. So we're looking at digital certification. We're not going to fully go over to digitizing certification straight from the off. We're going to run in parallel, but we look at a time when actually and certificates in hard copy will be available to anyone that wants them. But we're looking to move more to digitizing certification in the future. And that's a response to what young people want. And then things that Kate was talking about, apprenticeship units will be available for providers and employers to pick. There'll be more upfront advice and guidance. So we're working really hard at the moment on apprenticeship.gov. To put more visibility for young people up front. So things like progression, what can they earn, what are the options to a young person, and that will really help them. And also more advice and guidance for linking in apprenticeship.gov into Find an Apprenticeship as well, and making sure there's seamless links between those two sites. And then there's more ILR changes, change of circumstance, which Perdit will go through in detail when he comes to the demo. And then things like the Apprenticeship app, we're going to be making improvements to that. And then going on to later in the year, between July and September, Kate mentioned the incentives. So they will be available for new hires in October. And payments will then, the first payments will be 90 days after October, so in January time. And this is for SMEs who are taking on new hires who are aged between 16 and 24. And the final bit really, so there's system changes around the reducing the levy expiry as well, and removing levy top up. So levy expiry will reduce from 24 months to 12 months. So that's quite a big change in the service. And then to accommodate all of this, there are changes internally, which means that my delivery teams can respond to policy changes. So we're taking ownership of what we call the earnings calc. So that's something that generates all of the payments to providers. So if we want to make policy changes quickly, we can respond, and we can make sure that all of the providers get paid accurately for all of the training that occurs. The final bit I'll just end on is Nick will be running more of these webinars in the future. There's quite a lot of detail in this, but we will be running more of these webinars, but also a plea from me, we're always looking for employers and providers to use a test with, because my team, although we respond to policy, we also respond to user needs as well. So we want to get out there and work with you to make sure the service is as simple as possible. Nick, back over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary. And just picking up on that last point that Gary mentioned about, or the point Gary made about the future webinars and other engagement. When I mentioned earlier on the survey as you leave the webinar, one of the questions in there is asking you about your views on what topics we should cover in future webinars. So if you can, please put into that survey response any webinars or any topics that you'd like us to go into a bit more detail in any future sessions. But yes, we do have a webinar program, and we'll be running as many of these as we can throughout the year. Okay. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Kate, for giving us your updates. Really detailed and insightful information about the Growth and Skills Levy and how the Apprenticeship Service is responding. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Okay, so and also thanks everybody for submitting the questions. Lots and lots of questions have come in, and we'll try our best to work through as many as we can and cover all the main topics that you've asked about. Okay, panel, so if you're ready, I'm going to ask you some questions. The first one I think is for Kate. Kate, there's a question here saying, what is classed as an SME? Is this just a non-levy employer?
Hi there. Yes. So non-levy employers are what we consider as SMEs. You will often find, though, in when we have press notices or if ministers speak about it publicly, they'll use the phrase SME just because that has more understanding to the sort of wider public. But yes, please assume when you see that, what we actually mean is non-levy payers. Cool.
And Tom, I've got a question for you, and this is about sort of the announcement about standards being defunded and some of the rationale, particularly when it's around encouraging apprentice investment in young people, but some of the qualifications are at degree level and above. I've summarised that question a bit, but I think that gives you the main gist of it. Have you got a response for that?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, first thing I'd say is completely recognise this is a change. So us setting out a set of priorities and sort of shifting more of our funding towards those will feel different, and we completely understand that. I think on the individual standards that people have name checked in their questions, it's simply the case that when you compare them to other apprenticeships, they are not doing as much as that sort of stuff. So if you look at the degree apprenticeships, whilst it is true that there are a proportion of younger people who are using them in the sort of way that you've just set out, most of the time that isn't the case. And in a world where we have the sorts of trends that Kate was talking about at the start in terms of how starts have shifted around in the programme, and in a world where we have a finite sort of budget to work with, those are the sorts of really difficult choices ministers have to make. So that there will always be some people who don't quite fit into that decision making, or some examples, but on the whole that is the position, and that's why we've come to the decisions we have.
Cool, thank you. Kate, we had quite a few questions about the incentives that are being introduced, and I think a lot of them came in before you had covered it on the slide. But there's things like how's the incentive going to be paid, and things like how the incentives could be potentially layered up. The different incentives could be layered up. Could you just give a little bit of information about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the SME incentive that will be going live later on this year, that will be paid in 2 instalments. The first instalment will be on day 90. So once the apprentice has started their apprenticeship and made it through that sort of first 90 days of the apprenticeship, they'll get half of that incentive, and then the remaining half will come at the end of year 1. So on day 365, that will be paid. They will operate in the same way as our other incentives that go to employers. So they will go via providers. And I think there was a question which was around, will it be the same as the COVID incentives where it's paid directly to employers? It won't be. It will be paid via providers. And the reason for that is to protect public money and to make sure that we've got really strong rigour and reassurance that those payments are genuine and that they are going to genuine employers with genuine apprentices. So that's how the SME incentive will operate. They can be, as I mentioned in the presentation, they can be layered on top. So if someone is getting the SME young person incentive, they will also be able to get the foundation apprenticeship incentive if it is a foundation apprenticeship. And somebody asked a question about, will the 16 to 18 incentives still be available for all employers, not just SMEs? And the answer to that is yes, that's correct. So that's that original 16 to 18 incentive, which has been in place for quite some time, that is unchanged and is available to levy payers and non-levy payers alike.
Cool, thank you, and thank you for covering some of the questions that we've got to come as well. That's helpful. Shona, a question for you about apprenticeship units. Says, will you be providing more detail on what you expect the skills test for units to look like, along with any associated audit requirements?
Hi Nick, thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So we normally don't dictate what the skills test for onboarding an apprentice is. So we've taken the same approach here. But if anybody feels that they would need a bit more advice and guidance, feel free to pop that into the feedback on the draft rules, and we're happy to pick it up there. If there's anything specific that's worrying you, do please let us know. What we would look for is sort of professional estimates of what an appropriate test is for the course. Obviously, the courses are all very different to full apprenticeships because they are those short units. So we were looking for something proportionate. But if you don't think the detail is quite enough, do please let us know. Cool,
thank you. Kate, a little change into levy co-investment. There's a question here about when the change from 95% to 75% comes into effect. Could you just clarify that for me?
Yeah, so those changes to the system changes will come into effect from September of this year, or sorry, from August of this year. So that is the 10%, that is the change to co-investment, and that is the expiry period. So all of those will come into effect from August.
Thank you. And Gary, I think Kate's already mentioned something around the payment, the £2,000 payment, and how that's going to be made. There's a question here about whether or not that will be done automatically from DWP, or does it need to be claimed, or does it come from as a rebate from HMRC? Is there anything you want to add to Kate's answer beforehand about how that incentive payment will be paid?
No, it's a very good answer by Kate. I think it will be paid via the service, so it doesn't need to be claimed from DWP. It will be paid by us. There will be an upfront. We'll have to check as Kate worked through the detail of the age. There is a bit of checking that we need to do to make sure that actually it is a new employee and an SME. So there's a bit of cross-checking in our payment system, but we will make that payment from the service to the provider, and then the provider will pass that payment on to employer.
Okay, thank you very much. And then Kate, back to you if I can. There's a question here about the employer national insurance breaks for apprentices that are under 25, and they're basically asking whether they're still remaining.
Yes, absolutely. So that national insurance break will continue for apprentices under 25, and that's something that the government is really keen to promote as well, because we think actually there are quite a lot of employers who aren't aware that exists. So we'll be really sort of redoubling our efforts to make sure that employers are aware of that as part of the incentive package to encourage people to take on apprentices.
Cool, thank you. And Shona, I've got a couple of questions about foundation apprenticeships and eligibility. So there's one about confirming the age of the potential apprentices that can start a foundation apprenticeship, and also one about is the foundation quals incentives only for non-levy employers as well. So if you wouldn't mind just addressing both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So for foundation apprenticeships, the main cohort are aimed at 16 to 21-year-olds, but we've offered a slight extension to those who've maybe had a slightly slower start. So anybody who's 22 to 24, who's either prisoner, prison leaver, care leaver, will also be able to start. So primarily 16 to 21, but with an extension to 24 for those who need it. And in terms of the incentives, they're available to all employers. It's not differentiated by employer size.
Cool, thank you. And Jason, a question for you if I can. There've been quite a few of these comments, questions coming in. This is from a large employer, and that they're recognising in their question here that it's important that they check and track their levy contribution. particularly in terms of current and projected spend, and the capability of the Apprenticeship Service account has been changed recently to so that it's for this particular employer that's causing them some difficulties. Have you got any comments that you can make to the employer?
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, it's a good question. I think the changes that have been made to the way that the levy is made available and the way that it can be spent, as well as some of the complexities in the way that we already manage the funding within the programme, mean that we need to look at the best way of supporting employers to understand the funds that they have available to them, and how those funds are being used to support both their existing employees, but also those employees and apprentices that they want to take on going forward. So it's certainly an area that we are continuing to look at. We made some changes quite recently to illustrate the way that funds are coming into and going out of the account more clearly, and we'll continue to use feedback that we receive through sessions like this and some of the user research that Gary mentioned earlier to ensure that we continue to iterate and develop that for you.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, a very provider-specific question here about so where a provider is at risk of one standard of the achievement rate being low, for example, will they be allowed to deliver apprenticeship units that are where they're strong on other standards?
Hi Nick, thank you. So for eligibility on units, we're looking at the eligibility isn't set at an achievement rate level. So we've got more information coming out on that shortly, just to explain to providers about where delivery will come. So that'll be in, I think, the next week or so, that something will be coming out to providers just confirm who's in scope, to provide that detail of where it sits.
Okay, thank you. And Kate, question about the future of apprenticeship units, and so how quickly do you think that we're going to have additional apprenticeship units being developed and being made ready for funding outside of the initial 7 that we've had announced at the beginning of the week?
So we're hopeful that we'll be able to bring those out in a relatively rapid and speedy way as skills gaps emerge. During National Apprenticeship Week, Skills England committed to developing new apprenticeship units in as little as 3 months, where an emerging skills gap comes forward, particularly if it's to do with an infrastructure project or particularly relevant to young people. And as I said earlier, because we'll be drawing on existing apprenticeship standards to create those apprenticeship units, we know we have a lot of confidence and excellent content there in terms of those knowledge and skills in terms of the existing apprenticeship. So hopefully that will be a relatively speedy process, that we will see those come out increasingly fast over time.
Thank you very much. And there's shown another question about apprenticeship units, and this is a little distinction, because we have some employers who are also training providers as well, and this, I assume this person from an employer provider is asking whether they'll be able to deliver apprenticeship units as well.
Yeah, interesting. So yes, the same criteria would be applied to employer providers as would the rest of the provider base.
Cool, thank you. And Sarah, I think I've got a message here saying, received a letter earlier this week from DfE stating that they put a cap on the number of new starts for apprenticeships in which funding is being withdrawn. Can you confirm when that cap starts?
Thank you. So the cap is for new starts. So from the point of letter, providers have each got individual caps on which they need to operate for that delivery. So obviously existing learners on programme will continue to be supported, but to manage transition and make sure that we've got an orderly exit for starts, each provider that have delivered previously will have had an individual letter by now from us to say what their cap is and what they need to operate in and the end period for that. So that's quite an individual thing according to each provider. If a provider's got a question or doesn't feel that that cap's been fairly set based on the evidence of the ILR data, for example, then there is a route for them to put a query in to question that or ask for more information.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a couple of questions about what happens to people partway through an apprenticeship that's being defunded, and I think you've addressed that, so we'll skip over those. Kate, there's a question about so it's asking, is there a recognition that defunding the management quals will directly impact young people in terms of their employee experience, learning and growth, and ultimately their professional impact?
Yeah, and Tom covered this a little bit, but what I would say is of those 16 standards that we are defunding, the vast majority of starts on those are over 25. So about 90% of the people doing those standards are aged over 25. Over 80% of the people doing those standards have been with their employer for more than 12 months. So we absolutely recognise that, you know, these are important skills for employers. They're important skills for employees. But as part of that prioritisation process, ministers have been really clear that we need to be focusing the funding on standards that are focused around these industrial strategy priorities, focused around young people, and these ones are primarily not meeting those ministerial objectives. We will be thinking and working with employers about, you know, what might be useful apprenticeship units or short courses, and whether any of those might be in elements around leadership and management. So that will definitely be a conversation going forward. But, you know, we are spending a significant part of our budget on these standards, and they've been available for a long time and people have benefited from them, and that is fantastic. But going forward, in terms of ministerial priorities, we do need to reprioritise, and these are the choices that ministers have made.
Thanks, Kate. Tom's a comment or a question. Yeah, so it's about hospitality, the sector being seasonal in nature. So there's a question from an employer saying, how come they recruit an apprenticeship or recruit to an apprenticeship when their seasonal offering is between March and November, and the training lasts for 12 to 15 months? Any thoughts on that?
They might have to clarify if I'm sort of misunderstanding the question, but, you know, broadly speaking, we apprenticeships are a roll-off program. That's really important, and that flexibility is really important, precisely for the reasons you just set out in terms of seasonal workers. We've done quite a lot of things to help deliver some of that flexibility. So we've looked at the minimum duration, which for some people is kind of neither here nor there, but actually for some sectors where you do have seasonal work and you work in that way, that's really, really helpful and important to them. So we took it from 12 months down to 8 months, so everyone's in the same place, and we'll keep looking at sort of pragmatic things like that. You know, we have a really, really strong and mature program here, and we've been working in partnership with loads of people on this call for a very long time, so we're always up for a conversation on where, you know, some sort of pragmatism might help. And I think the sort of the minimum duration work is probably quite a good example of that. While we're there, I think it's just worth referencing that you know, we are trying to sort of maximise the opportunities for sectors like hospitality that do bring in lots of young people, and that's what some of the foundation apprenticeship announcement was about as well.
Cool, thank you. Jason, an employer I think has just gone over the cusp and moved into being a levy paying employer, so has got sort of relatively limited funds into their accounts for the year now, and they previously just paid the 5% co-investment, and they're asking what happens if the sort of the relatively modest levy budget that they've accumulated so far doesn't cover the cost of apprentices.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, the threshold that describes when an employer becomes a levy payer is set at £3 million of their payroll value. So it is a reasonably significant threshold. And the reason I labour that point is because once you are considered to be a levy payer, then the rules for all levy payers apply. Recognise that as an employer who is growing and just coming into that threshold, that means that it can be a little bit of a significant change, but it's important that we have a consistent way of applying the rules. So yeah, in this case, you will be treated for all of your new starts, and you'll be treated as a levy paying employer. The hope is obviously that if a business is growing, that it will continue to grow, and so the funds available to you in your account would continue to grow over time.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about the apprenticeship app and so where can we find it. I think Gary mentioned the apprenticeship app in his presentation, and that's available through the Apple Store and Google Play, and is designed for apprentices to download, so they can find it there. And any employers or providers that want to see what the app looks like, they can. We put together a webinar, and the recording is actually on our YouTube channel, and I'll share the details of how to access the YouTube channel a little bit later on. But yeah, so employers and providers can see what the app looks like by looking at the that webinar recording, and apprentices can go and download it from the app stores. Okay, Mary, quick question for you if I can. How will the transition from 24 months expiry of funds in levy paying employers' accounts to 12 expiry?
Thank you, Nick. Yes, so the new rules for the shorter expiry period will apply to any new funds entering a levy payer's account from August of this year. Any funds that are already in the account before that point will retain their 24-month expiry period. So the change will just be for new funds entering from August. Okay,
thank you. And I think there's another question about the month that's going to take effect, so that's covered that one as well. And if I just scroll down, because we're nearly at the end of our time for this Q&A session, just see if there's anything else I can capture. I think that's done as well. I think I am going to leave it there because most of those have been covered already. And what I will do is Kate, is there anything that you've seen in the questions as a theme that I've not asked yet, or as a theme that we've not addressed yet? And Gary, if you could think about the same thing, I'm going to ask you the same thing as well. So is there any question that we've not covered, theme that you'd like just to address?
So I think one of the things that was in the questions, which isn't related to the recent announcements, but is a useful opportunity to clarify, is around shorter duration apprenticeships. So about a year or so ago, we changed the funding rules so that apprenticeships can be 8 months in duration rather than a minimum of 12. And as Tom mentioned earlier, that's particularly valuable to some sectors like hospitality. We've seen huge take up in the use of that flexibility for trainee teachers. It can apply if somebody has got a prior attainment that they want to have considered as part of their apprenticeship. So if anyone isn't aware of that, and conscious we've covered quite a lot of content today, that is something that I would direct people to, because that might be a really valuable delivery opportunity.
Cool. Thank you. Gary, anything from you? Any questions that I may have, or themes that I may have missed and not addressed yet?
Yeah, not specifics, Nick, around what we've spoken about. I suppose we will have more detail as we develop the products come online, the functionality expands. But we've got a really good help desk. So although there's lots of information, advice and guidance online in the service, we do regularly update knowledge articles. So if employers or providers are struggling, or they've got any questions for us, do contact the service desk, and they can help those employers and providers with any of those questions that may crop up as these products are available, or we develop the service. There was a question I did see around the expansion of apprenticeship.gov, which we're looking at changing that, not dramatically, but in a positive way, putting more links in terms of what an apprentice could earn. So information for young people, more information, advice and guidance between now and June. So look out for that.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Nick, just to interrupt, there's just one point that I just wanted to clarify that I forgot to mention just now, which is for any of those standards being defunded, just to be really clear that only applies for new starts from the 1st of September onwards. Anybody who's already doing one of those apprenticeships, we will absolutely continue to fund that as we have done in the past, for example, around level 7. So I wouldn't want anyone to be concerned if they've got a learner who's on one of those apprenticeships. It won't impact on those people.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to call time on our first Q&A session. We've had so many more questions than we could actually get around to answering in the time we had available. But thank you to everybody that answered questions for getting through as many as you did in the time we had, and thank you everybody for submitting the questions. What we will do is we'll take the questions away. We share them around different teams within DFE so that we can make sure that we understand what you're saying in terms of user research. We feed that through into the dev team so that they can listen to your feedback and build that into their designs in the future. And certainly for Gary and Kate, they could be looking at the types of questions you're having and feeding those back into our policy colleagues, and thoughts about how we design the service moving forward. So the questions aren't lost. Thank you for submitting them. What we will do is we will have a look at any of the key themes and issue some clarification points if we need to in a couple of weeks' time. So yeah, thank you very much for doing that. Okay, so we need to move on now and into the second part of our webinar. So we've had a look at the Growth and Skills Levy, we've looked at the policy announcements, and we've looked at how the Apprenticeship Service is developing. What I want to do now is just spend a little bit of time looking at one of those main developments, and it featured quite heavily in the questions that we've just gone through. We want to look at apprenticeship units. So we want to, I've got Perdip, Nihal, Amika Ashar and Sam Miller lined up to take us through how the service is going to handle apprenticeship units moving forward. So Perdip, I think I've got you first, so over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. And good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Perdip now, Product Manager in the Apprenticeship Service, and I'll now give you an overview of how apprenticeship units will be funded through the Apprenticeship Service and who's responsible for what. Okay. So to begin on this slide, the first thing to call out is that if you're a non-levy employer, you'll need to reserve funds for each learner. Next, it's important to remember that only providers can add learner details for apprenticeship units. That's a deliberate design choice to keep things accurate and consistent, as providers hold the individual learner data, and this supports the strategic direction we're moving with for apprenticeships. Apprenticeship units can also be funded by transfer of levy funds. Therefore, if employers have transfer funds available in their account and they wish to use this, they'll need to initiate the learner request, selecting this option on the Select Funding page, as done for apprenticeships. And finally, apprenticeship unit learners will only appear in the service after the provider has submitted them through the individual learner record. So the ILR first, then they show up in the provider's account, then they can be sent to the employer for approval. We'll now go through this in more detail on the next few slides. Okay, so reserving funds is nice and simple. Employers can reserve funds themselves just like they do today for apprenticeships, but if they've given permissions to the provider can do this on their behalf, which many employers prefer. As soon as you start typing in the search box, you'll see apprenticeship unit courses appear in the predictive list, so you don't need to know the exact title, they'll appear automatically. And just a quick reminder, if you're a provider and you don't have permissions, it's worth nudging the employer early so they can reserve those funds before they start adding the learners. And that's all there really is to this step for non-levy funded units. Find the right course, reserve the funds, and you're ready for the next stage. Okay, so let's look at what the process looks like for an employer initiating adding a learner request. This bit is very quick. Employers don't add apprenticeship unit learner details themselves. Instead, when they get to the how would you like to add learners page, they simply choose send a request to my training provider. And that sends a notification straight to the provider so they can complete the learner details. If you're a non-levy paying employer or have levy transfer funds available, you'll see a funding page also appear to select from. We also updated the help text, so it's clear that this route is expected for apprenticeship units. So the employer's role is selecting funding type, choose the option and send the request, and wait for the provider to add the details. Next slide, please. Okay, so now switching over to the provider side, this is where the detailed work happens. For apprenticeship units, the process starts with the individual learner record submission. Providers submit the learner details in their ILR first, and once that's processed, the details automatically appear in the Apprenticeship Service account after approximately 15 minutes. Once the record is available, the provider can attach it to the employer request and send it to the employee for approval. So again, the individual learner record submission first, the record appears in provider account, and learners added to their request and then submitted to the employer for approval. Any changes or corrections required to details in the service will also need to be made by the provider in the individual learner record. This approach minimizes the need for manual entry in the service and helps keep everything aligned between our systems. And on to the next slide. Now, the good news on this slide is that apprenticeship units have a simpler setup than full apprenticeships. So a few things not required for unit learners, that there's no apprentice account required to confirm details, no standard options, there's no recognition of prior learning, there'll be no breaks in learning, and the price is also fixed. So all of this makes the onboarding process quicker and lighter for employers and providers. I did see a couple of questions in the chat that came up in regards to some of the developments that we've been doing for the ILR-driven process. So for, I think someone asked about the select multiple option. So last year we did complete the first step to enable select multiple by creating auto reservations. Hopefully providers have experienced the benefit of this when the start date is within the same month. Following the initial testing of select multiple, we improved designs and made some changes to ensure it meets accessibility standards and aim to have this released later in the year, around June or July. Another question that came up relevant to this page is around break-in learning and withdrawals from the ILR to update the service. So good news on that front is that we'll be using individual learner data for approved records to update learner records in the service, and this will start with stops and pauses and then extend to other changes of circumstances as well. So we'll be working on that in the coming months too. Okay, and all of this, it's intentionally streamlined so that units and the ILR-driven process is easy, flexible, and helps fast setup of learner records. We'll now give you a demo of the full flow, so the employer journey and the provider journey. And if you just bear with us, we'll just swap over the screens and Amika will give you a walkthrough.
Yeah, so as Perdip said, it's going to take just a second or two just to swap screens for Amika to do her part. So I'll just remind you that if you've got any questions for Perdip, Amika and Sam, if you can just drop them into the question box as well. We'll get to those after we've done the demo.
Hi everyone, I'm Amika. I'm one of the designers that are working on the employer account, employer and provider account. So I'll just take you through a demo of what the journey should look like. Just to let you know as well, this is kind of a prototype, so not everything will work, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of what we'll go through. So first we'll go through the employer process for adding learners doing apprenticeship units. So as you enter the employer account, from the homepage, you would click on learners. Then you would add a learner or send a learner request. You would read through the guidance on screen and click Start Now when you've read and understood everything. And you choose the organisation. So for the purposes of this example, we're going to be using Digital and Electronic Stores Limited. Then we would choose the funding option. So the screen may look unfamiliar to some of you. This screen is only seen for non-levy employers. But yeah, so in this example, we're using reserved funds. Then you would choose a reservation. So for this one, it's AI for Retail Operations Apprenticeship Unit. You would choose your main training provider, as you currently do, and then provided you've chosen the correct training provider, you click yes, it's correct group. And this is the screen where you'll see the most changes compared to what you're used to. So we've introduced this new kind of explanation of what apprenticeships and apprenticeship units are, as I know some employers and providers are still kind of getting familiar with them. Then you would kind of read this notice that says you must send a request to your training provider to add apprenticeship units. So the kind of key thing that employers need to know is that apprenticeship units can only be added via by the training provider. So you would click here and type the names of the learners you'd like to add. This will be sent to your training provider that we've chosen, which in this example is Future Skills Group. Press continue, and then that learner request would be sent to the training provider. Now I'll show you the employer journey, the provider journey. So we're in the Future Skills Training Group is the name of the provider we're using today. So we'd click on add new learners, and then how would you want to add learner details? This again is the kind of key thing that training providers need to know. So learner details for apprenticeship units must be added via ILR only. Regular apprenticeships can be added via manual add, CSV, or ILR, but apprenticeship units can only be added by ILR. So you would choose that first option if you're choosing an apprenticeship unit, press continue, and then read this. And provided you're comfortable with everything, press continue. If you're following on from what the employer just did and you're trying to add the 2 learners that were just sent through, you would add to an existing cohort. But in this example, we're going to create a new cohort. Then you would choose an employer. So this time we're using digital and electronic stores, and confirm your employer if you're happy with the correct one. Choose a reservation. So this time we're using AI for Retail Operations. Select a learner from Digital and Electronic Stores Limited. So we've added a new filter here to allow you to filter by apprenticeship unit quickly. So you can choose that and you'll be filtered with all your apprenticeship units that you have, all your learners you have doing apprenticeship units. So in this instance, we're going to choose Mohammed. Then you can check learner details. As this learner has been added via ILR, if you do want to change any details, you'll need to update the details in the ILR, submit learner data, and then they'll update here. You won't be able to change learner details on this page itself within the DAS. You'll need to do it within the ILR. Then you click add, and then that cohort or group is now sent to the employer for approval. Yeah, those are the employer and provider kind of processes for how you add learners to the to learners who are doing apprenticeship units to the apprenticeship service.
Okay, thanks very much, Amika. We're just going to take back over control of the screen, and then we'll put some slides back up, and then we'll have Perdit picking up the slides from there. So just bear with us just for 2 seconds whilst we get the slides back. Right, there we go.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nick, Jazz, and thank you, Amika, for the demo walkthrough. So before we finish on this section, a recap of the 5 key things to remember about apprenticeship unit. So the first one that's come on the slide there is that non-levy funded learners must have funds reserved and in advance where possible. The second one is where providers add all the learner details. So that's done via the individual learner record and no action there for the employers. Employers can send a blank request if needed, especially when using levy transfer funds or the provider hasn't been given permissions. And providers must submit unit learners through the individual learner record before the start date. And finally, employers must approve the request before funding can start. So in essence, providers submit the data, employers review and approve the data. That's the core flow that keeps everything working smoothly. I'll now hand over to Sam to talk through the earnings and payments for apprenticeship units.
So, good afternoon. Thank you, Perdip, and thank you for going through the slides. As Perdip just mentioned, I'm Samila, Senior Product Manager in the Apprenticeship Service. And if you go on to the next slide, please. And so I just want to go through a little bit around the information around how we'll be generating those earnings and processing the payments for apprenticeship units. So for apprenticeship units, as Perdip has touched base on and has mentioned, those units will be recorded on the ILR first, and then sort of that data will be coming through to the Apprenticeship Service. So for April 2026, and then for the rest or the remaining of the academic year, providers will have to submit any delivery for apprenticeship units on funding model 99. Now, I know that's normally for privately funded apprenticeships, but we are sort of adapting that funding model to allow apprenticeship units to also be submitted. Providers will have to add what is called a Learning Delivery Monitoring Code, which you may be familiar with, an LDM code of 403, which will indicate when somebody has started on an apprenticeship unit, and then that information will come through to the Apprenticeship Service. Apprenticeship unit information and all the minimum delivery hours, the maximum delivery period, the price banding, and etc. will be available on the Learning Aim Reference Service, which is LARS, and the relevant LARS code will then have to be recorded on a provider's ILR within the Learning Aim reference. As Perdip mentioned, that data then will come from ILR into the Apprenticeship Service, and that data, there'll be no manual route to add apprenticeship units onto the service. Employers will be able to have that option to notify or request, as Perdip has said, for their provider to add the details. And importantly, employers will still have to approve apprenticeship units before any sort of payments are made throughout the service. The earnings, as we sort of see them as kind of indicative earnings at the moment, or just like apprenticeships, so they will be split into two. So there'll be a 30% indicative earning for 30% of time between the start date and the planned end date. And then there will be the 70% indicative earning for when is the planned end date that is recorded in the ILR. Payments again, similar, will be split into two, but rather than actually paying these on the date or on the indicative earnings date, 30% will be paid when the provider declares that 30% of delivery has happened and has been completed. And a provider will do that again with another LDM code, but this time 404 on their ILR. And then the 70% of the payment will be made when the completion status, again on a provider's ILR, is set to 2, completed, there's an actual end date added, and an outcome of 1 is achieved. We will only process those 2 payments at those 2 points, so the LDM code 404, and again on those three bits of criteria that are met within the sort of completion status fields. Once payments have been made, then employers will be able to see that information within their account on the Apprenticeship Service, just like they can do today with apprenticeship payments. And then in terms of reports, for provider and provider reports, we will be submitting that data back through Submit Learner Data, just like we do currently for apprenticeships, but on funding model 36. But obviously this time this will be for apprenticeship units through funding model 99. So we'll have the indicative earnings reports, the monthly payment reports, the funding summary, and the co-investment contributions reports. So again, you'll be able to see exactly where you will be sort of required, if wanted or needed to go get co-investment contributions from employers. On to the next slide, please. And so with this page, I just wanted to go through sort of payments that maybe have been asked, maybe I guess throughout this chat, which I've seen some already, but also which people may be familiar with apprenticeships. So apprenticeships obviously has the 16 to 18 incentives and the 19 to 24 incentives. With apprenticeship units, we won't be doing any additional incentives like those. And as Kate mentioned at the start, apprenticeship units are for 19 plus. English and maths, there will be no requirement for the English and maths to be completed on the apprenticeship unit, especially in terms of declaring that information through your ILR. And so no government funding available to be collected through the funding model 99 on there. Learning support. Learning support will be available, but instead of the £150 a month payments that you see for apprenticeships, this is now just a one-off payment of £150, which will be for a whole apprenticeship unit. Again, for April, there is no learning support that is actually collected on Funding Model 99. So providers will have to claim this through their earnings adjustment statement. Providers can claim more than £150 where it is required and where it is needed, but there is the exceptions process, which is similar in place for apprenticeships, that is above the £19,000 sort of claim. So if providers do need, for whatever reason, to be putting in more than £150 worth of learning support, then they will go through this exceptions process. Care leaver bursary, so there is no additional care leaver bursary for when a learner is going on to an apprenticeship unit. And breaks in learning, again, I can see this has been mentioned a couple of times in questions, but there is no requirement on the ILR for a provider to record a break in learning on their ILR. And that's for apprenticeship units. It is in the funding rules or in the draft rules that have been shared that providers will be allowed an additional 8 weeks on top of the maximum sort of delivery period to complete an apprenticeship unit, and that's to accommodate for any unforeseen circumstances where you may usually sort of see a break in learning, what you record a break in learning for on the Apprenticeship Service. I think there was a question which perhaps maybe may touch on, which is around like, does the employer still have the ability to pause or stop when a break in learning is there? So we'll come on to that one, but yeah, I think that's it for me. I'll hand over back to Nick.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you, Perdip and Amika, for your inputs as well. Guys, we're running about 6 or 7 minutes behind schedule, so we'll go through the Q&A session, but if we can do a sort of a really rapid, quick-fire Q&A, that will be really grateful. I'll be really grateful, so we can catch up a bit of time. So, Perdip, if I can ask you the first question. Reserving funding. So the question now is, there's been quite a few questions actually about reserving funding, about what period of time. So the first question is it still over a 3-month period like normal? But is there, if anything else you can say about reserving funds would be handy at this point?
Yes, so for apprenticeship units, when you come to reserve funds through the reservations journey, it will be for the current month and the next 2 months. But in the individual learner record, we will have a look at the date. Any future start dates will, outside the reservation window, will not show, but any historic dates will show when they're in the provider's account. So when they select the non-levy employer, it will then, the validation that present today will come into effect.
Cool, thank you. And Sam, how will the payments for the 30 and 100% milestones be triggered? So how's the service going to know, what's being delivered when we've done flex hours?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So just as I've just gone through, so the payments will actually be triggered. The first one will be when the provider has added that LDM code 404. That will trigger to say that 30% of the learning delivery hours, or the 30% of that apprenticeship unit, has been delivered. And then the final milestone, or the completion milestone, I guess you could say, will be triggered when the provider has added the 3 key bits of information of the completions. That's the completion status to say this apprenticeship unit has completed. There is the learning actual end date to say when that learning actually finished and was all done. And then there is the outcome, which is was this person successfully achieved, partially achieved, or the achievement is still ongoing. But it's that successfully, just the outcome status of achieved.
Cool, thanks, Sam. Perdip, will the details of the appear straight after provider sends in the ILR at any point, or is it just so not just at the final month-end return?
Yeah, so I think it was briefly covered earlier about once the individual learner record is submitted, give it at least, say, about 15 minutes, and you'll see that data cut across from the submit learner data service into the Apprenticeship Service provider account. So 15 minutes.
Okay, so there is a provider that's saying that they've had some issues where the apprentice details have been submitted on the ILR, but they've not appeared immediately or within 15 minutes. Is there something that they're either doing wrong, or is there any reason why that could be?
Now, there is a we've identified there is a known issue for some learners that have already got live apprenticeships or complete apprenticeships in the service that are not appearing in that list in the provider's account. So there is a fix for that is pending with one of the delivery teams. So we do apologise for that experience. But if you haven't reported to the support desk already, please do so, because we are keeping a log of the number of users that are impacted by this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Please do make sure you use the support desk. I'll give you their details in a couple of minutes. Perdip, another one for you. How do employers stop payments if there's no break in learning on apprenticeship units? Oh, sorry, no, not if there's no break in learning. How do employers stop payments if there is a break in learning in apprenticeship units?
Yeah, so if there's no break in learning, but in that case, on the employer's account, they still got the pause feature. So what we are developing and working on at the moment is a pause payments. As we continue with our development of changes being driven from the individual learner record, the apprentice status will only be updated from the provider changes, but there will be a pause payment feature on the employer's account. So if there is a break for whatever reason, the payments can be paused. But for apprenticeship units specifically, it's not anticipated that there will be any breaks in learning. There will be an extension of up to 8 weeks that are allowed in the exceptional circumstances. So I'd suggest looking back at the funding rules for the apprenticeship units, which have been released this week.
Thank you. Jason, quick question for you, if I may. So this is a really short question. It says, submit the ILR prior to start, question mark?
Absolutely. I realise that there's been a long-standing tradition of submitting the data after the start has occurred. But for apprenticeships, given the ILR-led route, we are actively asking you to submit the data before the apprenticeship has started, and where possible to reserve the funding in the service. But as Perdip's been talking through, if you don't do that, then the service will set that up for you in the background.
Thank you. And Sam, I'm not even going to pretend to understand this question. Will apprenticeship units have a ZProg 001 aim or just a qualification aim?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So there's this question, and then there's a couple of others as well, which is around maybe some of the details around number of hours and where to get that information. So yes, they will have a similar program aim reference. We're in the process of sort of going through those with the different apprenticeship units, and they will become available and will be announced through things like the ILR specification, but also on the learning aim record service as well. So additional details around apprenticeship units, the ZProgs, or it won't be ZProgs, but the program aims and that information that has to be recorded by a provider in their ILR will be coming out in like the ILR specification and guidance. Yes.
Okay, cool. And then just very quickly, Sam, is there anything that I've not addressed in this Q&A that as a theme that you'd like to address?
No, I'm not sure. No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think what we just mentioned there around it, I think somebody said, will Funding Model 99 be forever, or is this just an interim? What I would say is that this is the Funding Model 99 for when we go live for April for the rest of this academic year, and then we are looking at in terms of how this is set up on different funding models and ILR in future.
Okay, and thank you. And Perdip, any last thoughts of questions or themes that we've not addressed through the Q&A? I'm well aware we've missed loads of questions out here.
Not any particular themes. There are quite a few questions in there, and apologies for any that we haven't been able to answer today. But as Nick mentioned earlier, we will get responses out to you shortly after the webinar.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, thank you guys, Perdip, Amika, and Sam for your inputs and your responses to the questions. Yeah, as I mentioned, as Perdip just said, we'll take those questions away and issue some clarification points in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, so moving on quickly to the next slide, and I'll try and catch up time. Just wanted to remind you about our YouTube channel. I've mentioned it quite a few times. It's at DFE Sector Comms. There's 3 playlists on there that we've got. A recording of today's session will be on the Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings playlist in about 3 weeks' time, once we've subtitled it and made it accessible. And we've also got the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist, which is for all of our support videos covering the different functions of the Apprenticeship Service, and then videos created to support the delivery of apprenticeships are available in the Apprenticeship Support video playlist. Go onto the channel, subscribe, click on the bell icon, and you get alerts when new content is uploaded. And then on this slide, we've got a few links to the places that you can go to access support. So there's a PDF document that you can now download from the control panel on the screen under the handouts tab. So that way you don't have to scribble any of the details of the links down whilst they're on screen. In terms of other ways to stay up to date, go and have a look at apprenticeships.gov.uk if you haven't already. It's a great place for information for employers, providers, and for young people about apprenticeships and the Apprenticeship Service. Any of our training provider colleagues, there's the Further Education and Training Providers Community, which is a peer-led discussion forum for providers that offers great support. To register for any of our future webinars, I've included the link that you should follow, and by the beginning of next week we hope to have the recording of today's session available on that link as well, and that recording will stay there for about a month whilst we get the proper recording put onto YouTube at a later date. If you've got any specific queries about the Apprenticeship Service, you can use the self-service support tool, or you can email the support team as well, and their contact details are on the slide and on the handout. And then finally, what I've done is I've given you a link to the Growth and Skills Levy announcement press release, just so you can go and see that as well. So that's the end of our session. It's been a really, really heavy session in terms of all the information that we've provided to you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with us. And so please do make use of the recordings if you want to go back and double check anything that we've said. But yeah, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you to my presenters for all of their insights and the responses to the questions. And remember, as you leave, please complete the short survey. We would love to find out what you thought about today's session. So, excuse me, so that's it. Bye, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.